and welcome to this Let's Talk session with Peter Fraser, winemaker to Yangarra Estate Vineyard. Yangarra Estate is a biodynamic winery located in the Blewett Springs district of McLaren Vale, South Australia. The estate was founded by Jess Jackson of Jackson family in 1946. Yangarra is known for its biodynamic Shiraz wines, as well as its other leading grape Grenache. Its 87 hectares of vineyards comprise some 23-year-old vines. And the region's combination of ancient geology, higher altitude, and Mediterranean climate provide the, provide the ideal growing conditions for the best grape varieties of Southern Rhone. Peter Fraser, who I'm sure needs no introduction, has been the winemaker to the driving force behind Yangarra Estate Vineyard since 2000. So when it comes to winemaking philosophy, Peter focuses much of his attention on the vineyard and believes it is less about technique and more about preserving the essential taste of the vineyard. Finally, before handing over to Peter, I'd like to mention that he was nominated 2016's winemaker of the year by James Halliday as part of Halliday's Wine Companion Awards. So once again, thank you, Peter, and over to you.
Thank you. As I said, kind of as the questions come in, happy to answer them as we go, because I think it becomes a little more interactive. The topic was to coincide with, I think it's one of the many grape variety days, Shiraz Day coming up soon. With that, I'm going to share my screen, hopefully as smoothly as I did last time in the practice run, and use this to, there we go, and talk a little bit about kind of what goes into Shiraz for us. One of the things I would like to kind of probably start off with is the journey of Shiraz in Australia. And some of that takes back a little bit of history. In the early days, reds in Australia were called claret, which probably signifies the ones that were blended with Cabernet and probably firmer structured wines, and probably was the advent of Shiraz Cabernet. They would have been often probably dominated by Shiraz, but had some Cabernet in them. There was, and I'm talking probably very much South Australian specifically, Barossa and McLaren Vale. And then you would have seen the advent of Burgundies. They often were probably Syrah or Shiraz and possibly Grenache, or in some areas in Victoria, there was a famous wine called Wynn's Oven Valley Syrah, or it was just called Burgundy. And so later would have been, I think it had a few years where it was labelled as Shiraz. The Hunter Valley Burgundies were often Shiraz. Were generally Shiraz. And it's fascinating. I've had the good fortune to try a lot of those old wines, and incredibly how long-lived they were. I think some of them were probably picked quite early and were without much new oak. Some of them were probably actually picked very ripe. Again, probably not without much new oak, especially in those 50s and 60s and 70s. It wasn't, Grange was one of the very few wines that was starting to see a lot of new oak that Max Schubert was taking from his learnings in Bordeaux. And then there was also the wines called Hermitage, which were also Shiraz. So you had this very mixed bag of Shirazes, if you like, that were all called slightly something different, but they all had a very distinctive style. And then the French or the European winemakers got together and said, you can't use our names, which was probably a good thing. And so all of a sudden, I think the first vintage of Grange was 1990 to drop the name Hermitage and call it Shiraz. And through that journey, if you take from probably the 90s, the UK wine, Australian wine into the UK was running hot, huge growth in exports. And consequently, you had also wines like Rosemount and many other kind of what I'd call kind of higher volume commercial brands that were coming out and driving huge volumes of Shiraz throughout two of the biggest markets in the world, being that of the UK and the US. And in that period, I think there was a great thirst and quench for bigger, richer, riper, fruitier, fruit-driven wines. And Australian Shiraz got very much caught up into that trend. And it's not to say, though, that there was also the great wines that stayed their true course and continued on, great producers, Henschke, there's probably a myriad of them, Wendouree, and it's interesting now that the modern style is being probably very much refining the fruit, trying not to pick too early to express, I suppose, a more specific terroir characters, versus I find when Shiraz picks too ripe, it can actually start to all look the same, which is a great asset when you're a commercial winery trying to produce wines that taste the same year in, year out. And the other part, I think there's lots of bits and pieces that I'll touch on as we go through. So that kind of gets me rolling and as a bit of a start in kind of style perspective, and probably what I'd go through our winemaking is some of the understanding and know-how that I think is making wines with a greater sense of place, probably a greater sense of drinkability, and a greater sense of interest and complexity. So here, just to kind of familiarise yourself where we are, if you can see my little pointer on this thing, is there any nods? Can see my waving my pointer around. This is a map of McLaren Vale. All these funny colours are different geologies of the McLaren Vale district. There's I haven't got my glasses on, but a very faint pink line that kind of zigzags its way around. That is the boundary of McLaren Vale district. To the north of McLaren Vale is the city of Adelaide, and north of the city of Adelaide is the Barossa Valley, and to the east of Adelaide is the other wine district of the Adelaide Hills, which is driven a bit more by elevation in its coolness. McLaren Vale from the coast, you've got the Gulf of St Vincent out here that gives it a very Mediterranean climate, which makes it kind of warm in, very distinctive 4 seasons. But to the south, we also have the Southern Ocean. So this Gulf is kind of warm, and the Southern Ocean brings a lot of cool air. But interestingly, this Gulf buffers and gives a real moderateness. It also brings very reliable winter rainfall, and where Yangarra and also the other wines that I make at Hickambotham are up in this Blewett Springs, Clarendon area, which is much more affected by elevation. So you get much colder nights up in the elevated areas. And is very important, I think, to again make those Shiraz of distinctive style, because you get this longer, slower ripening period. The other part is the soils, and as I come across into this, is just a little blow up of the northeastern part. So you're kind of looking at this area here. Yangarra is here. Our vineyards traverse all the way out to here. So as it's actually, I think, about 90 odd hectares. We planted a few more vines since we probably wrote the last bits and pieces. And you can see here, there's this part here is the North Maslin Sand Formation, which is a 56 million year old ironstone formation. I'll show a picture of that in a minute. And then you've also got a sandy, this Blewett Springs Sands, which is white sands. I've got pictures of that as well. Fascinating to see the difference in character of Shiraz between the two soil types, or the geology types. Their soils are resultantly quite different. There's a bit of sand that traverses through into this ironstone, and a bit of ironstone rock that traverses through into the sand. You actually have this ironstone laying underneath this what do you call inland sand dune. It's an inland sand. It's not a marine sand. It's got no calcareous or shell type marine activity within it. This is the map of the estate. All the orange vineyards are Shiraz. The sand, there's this block, this block are very sand-like, and there's this block, and there's this block, this block, this block, and that block that are ironstone. The ironstone blocks tend to be much more generally, the structure of them tends to be grittier and it has a very much an iodide, meaty character. The Shiraz that grows on the sand, that's obviously has a clay layer underneath. The sand brings rise to great fragrance and perfume, much more in the red and blue fruit spectrum, and much finer, elegant tannins. So from a blending perspective, we make a few Shirazes, but we make an estate Shiraz that's, well, we make firstly a Shiraz that's primarily off the sand block that we use in a preservative-free Shiraz that's designed early drinking. I pick it quite early. So it is very much in that red blue fruit spectrum. We then also kind of put together all the bits and pieces of Shiraz off the estate to make an estate Shiraz, and we have two single block Shirazes that show exceptional character. This is this Kingswood block is a south facing block. It has ironstone with a bit of sand, but being south facing in the southern hemisphere, it's kind of shows the coolest characters, shows some lovely herbaceous characters. And again, a little bit, what's interesting, it has the power and the structure of the tannins of the ironstone, but it has more blue fruit. It's probably the most blue fruit in a cool year, sometimes a bit red fruited. And then Ironheart, which is north facing, again, has a lot of concentration and power. But when I say concentration, the other part I was going to talk about in styles is some of the more expensive collectible Shirazes, or actually, I should say more the expensive Shirazes, can be quite sweet tasting in terms of the mouth. The fruit is so concentrated that it nearly tastes sweet. And I kind of personally those kind of wines don't really appeal to me. The great Shirazes that have structure and power of fruit of flavour, but not necessarily heavy or jammy. So I'm very kind of careful when I'm talking about the power of Ironheart. It's more in that structural and concentration of flavour versus just viscosity of wine. Because of the climate, we're here to talk about Shiraz, but, we have pretty much all of the Southern Rhone varietals, and Grenache is probably one of the lead varietals in our region, although it only represents about 6% of our region. We're very heavy in Grenache. Shiraz represents closer to 50% of our region, so is the kind of majority variety of the region. This is that ironstone that I was talking about, and you'll see at the surface, this is a great kind of cutting. This was an old quarry that we've rehabilitated in the middle of the estate. Those lovely iron red colours, rusty red colours in the sandstone, and throughout our probably 3 best Shiraz blocks, you see that basically the soil is basically weathered, broken up versions of that rock. And like I said, they produce this weight and depth and beautiful structure to the tannins. This is actually at the top of the estate, in the middle of a bushvine Grenache block, it shows the white sands that you really don't see too many places around the world, and these are those sands producing that real fine and fragrance. One thing I didn't show you before I got into the winemaking was the vineyard side of things. To my mind, one of the other things that I think has been very important in the style of wine that we want to make is huge attention to detail in the canopy management. We have a single cordon, and we do vertical shoot positioning, probably much more to what you would see in Europe, and in kind of Burgundy, if you like. We don't have quite the same close planting in our trellis system of Shiraz, but there tends to be a lot of what I'd call sprawling canopies. For those of you who visited vineyards in both the Barossa and McLaren Vale, you see just large trellis bush-looking things. We feel that it's one part of our biodynamic and organic farming. We can't rely on chemicals to ensure that we don't get rot within our canopy. So we need really good airflow in our canopy. But we also see that with great sunlight penetration into the canopy, we get thicker skins, and we also get faster physiological flavour development. I think one of the challenges to Australian Shiraz is that the sugar, we get so much sunshine that the sugar is ahead of the flavour curve sometimes. And so producers end up having to hang the grapes out too long to get the right flavour ripeness or the right tannin ripeness. And in that stage, the wine has become quite heavy and viscous, versus at being able to pick at lower sugar levels, where the physiological ripeness has also come together. So I'd say that's one of the most critical things that we do in the vineyard. That's probably a little different to some of our other friends. But with that comes the potential for a little bit of sunburn. Before I get into how we kind of fix that, where you can get some raisening, one of the things, and it was interesting in just my general love of Pinot and Nebbiolo, I was reading, doing some reading, and it was just interesting seeing other producers and their philosophies around when they pick and what they're doing, and generally even climate change. And Shiraz probably, and Grenache actually teaches me a lot, because Grenache has no tolerance for being overripe, in my opinion. And the wines that are picked too ripe are heavy and clunky and lose all the beauty of what is great Grenache. In our climate anyway. There might be some exceptional vineyards somewhere else that manage to circumnavigate that. Shiraz has a sweet spot, and it's not too early and it's not too ripe, but it's probably a slightly higher ripeness than, say, Grenache, which works out generally quite well. Shiraz ripens early, and I find generally logistically is really quite easy to fit into the winery. So that, and it is one of the most critical winemaking decisions after the exposure that we do in the bunches to our winemaking and the style of Shiraz that we want to make. This next photo is back to what I was talking about. Of, yes, we then picked it, but we've exposed it. We may have got some sunburn on various berries. This is a vibrating and sorting table. There's 3 of them. We've got one through to the bunches. One, the second one that's not showing is a slotted machine that takes out any small raisins. And this is what's called a mistral, which picks up and blows out any of the larger raisins. So you end up with all these whole berries coming through. We generally do about 20% whole bunch. And whole bunch is another thing that I use in my toolbox. In our winemaking in a warmer year, I might do more whole bunch. With the whole bunch brings more finesse. You find that for whatever reason, those whole bunches bring more fragrance and more herbaceous characters, which I find brings more finesse in a warmer year. In a colder year, I might reduce the amount of whole bunch because otherwise the wine can be that slightly too herbal. It also brings some tannin, what I call slightly greener tannin structure to the wines. But also the whole bunch brings a kind of more savoury element to the fermentation, which helps to also fight against this excessive sunshine and excessive fruit characters in the wine. I'm nearly looking for them to be restrained and bound up into the wine, so that as the wine ages and evolves, more of that fruit's going to start coming out. So the wine's nearly going, as a young wine, slightly into that reductive character. And these other techniques that we use later on in our winemaking to advance that. And as we only crush probably about 30%, 30 to 40% of those berries. The ones that come through, those whole berries are also very important in giving the softness and fragrance. And we're also finding that through that fermentation time, that we're kind of getting a slower, much more gentle extraction by the berries being handled in that much more gentle fashion. This is a photo of the sorted fruit. And the varying kind of level of percentage of probably broken berries just through the process. This is kind of an example of whole berries.
Peter, Amanda has asked how much will your whole bunch vary by then, and do you have an example of a percentage on a hot year versus a cool year?
So our general is about 25%. In 2011, which was a very cold and wet year, it was 0. In another cold year, 2017, it was more like 20%. It didn't go down a huge amount. And it's interesting, it purely observational. 2018 and 19, I was kind of more stuck at the same 25%. And when I say that I would ramp it up in a warmer year, it's hindsight that's probably taught me that, just looking back at our 18 and 19 wines, if I was being ultra critical of them, I would say I know how I could get a little bit more refinement to those warmer years, and that would be by increasing the whole bunch from 25%. And my guesstimate moving forward would be around somewhere like 35 and 40%. I've trialed, rough fermenters of, higher percentages. And I find that I can sometimes run into stuck fermentations and all sorts of logistical issues from a fermentation perspective when I start to go too high. So generally 40% would be my upper echelon, just to what I've found works with our grapes and our kind of winery and all generally the techniques that we use. Obviously there's some great wines around the world that are, 100% and it works with their system. I've just never got on with it very well at that higher levels.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
With this share screen, I can't necessarily see the question. So
no, you can't. No, don't worry.
So just yell out and interrupt me as they do. So that gentle, those bins we actually then tip directly into our open fermenters. It's been an interesting evolution from cap management or managing the skins during fermentation. We've definitely over the last 10 years become more and more, our general trend has been longer time on skins, but less handling. We've really finessed the amount that we handle. We also used to do some cold soaks. It was actually only 2 years ago that I've stopped cold soaking. It was also driven out of a kind of in my observation and reading of wines of Burgundy, that it was all a trend of extraction, that cold soaking process, and that the kind of, I don't know whether that was ever myth, but that cold soaking got out a lot of the water soluble aromatics. But what I found was that time on skins as a cold soak increased the levels of extraction to when I wanted to be kind of holding them longer. I'd already broken the skins up much more in that earlier cold period. And so our thing is that we find kind of for the success of just even fermentation is that the wines finish completion to dryness much more reliably on skins for a start. And we're able to kind of bring the wine together and the tannins together and get, by the time they're coming off skins, there's a real resolve to the tannins. And some of those, like last few days on skins, we might not even do a pump over because there's not a lot of gas being produced. And we have like a little tarpaulin type thing that goes on the top of the fermenter towards the end of ferment to keep all the gas in. Another thing we find really important with making Shiraz is aerate when we do pump over, that we actually take the juice out via a splashing tray so it gets some air into the fermentation. It's a very reductive variety, produces a lot of sulfide, partly probably the lack of nitrogen inputs into the and potassium inputs into the vineyard. But Shiraz seems to be much worse than any other variety, and that bringing a bit of air into the fermentation is really important for a clean ferment. And it also helps to kind of get all those tannins kind of sticking together and building what I call a nice velvety kind of structure to the tannins. Generally, we're looking to start to press off after about 18, sometimes can be as long as nearly 30 days. But again, we probably might, in a ferment, in a total in a day, pump over for no more than 1 minute per tonne per day, maybe 2 minutes maximum. So when I say per tonne, so in a 5-tonne fermenter, it might only be 5 minutes, of maybe 10 minutes at absolute most. So, and then we generally go to, we only use 500 litre puncheons. We've done away with barriques totally, smaller barrels for Shiraz. We find we get much more, and again, it's back to that reductiveness. I also keep the puncheons on lees for at least the first 6 months, often 9 months of maturation. The lees act as an oxygen scavenger. The only time they might come off lees is if they get a little bit reductive and stinky. If they do get stinky, we'll get them off lees straight away. We're 100% French oak, which is probably a little bit different to a lot of Australian or South Australian producers. We tend to do quite low to medium long toasts where we're looking at fine grain, very low impact kind of barrels. We're looking for structure and spice. We're not looking for vanilla and smoky. There's one smoky type barrel that I use as very much a salt and pepper, bringing the wine. We want to showcase the place, not the oak. And the puncheons have been a great vehicle for doing that. And again, I think they help suppress that overtly fruitiness of our region and more showcases the structure and the complexity of flavours that our site shows, and more of the mineral type characters versus just this overtly fruitiness. And then generally, some of the wines, there's a particular, the Kingswood wine only goes through Malo in smaller in the puncheons, and then would finish its complete maturation in Foudre. But then generally most wine, after it's been in 500 litre barrel for the first 10 months going into the following vintage, would then finish its maturation in 25 or 45 hectolitre Foudre. I find they really bring the wine together. They bring kind of everything together. There's still enough kind of slow maturation going on that doesn't happen in bottle, but in a Foudre to kind of finish off the polish, if you like, to the wines. So that's kind of the general. There's a snapshot of, I did have a picture of Shiraz, and this is actually prior to our biodynamic farming, where there wasn't as much leaf plucking. If you looked at our canopy nowadays, you would see a very distinct fruiting zone with a canopy. So that photo would be about 2005, 2004. But it's a great photo. I use it because it shows the ironstone and the sand very clearly. And nowadays, you wouldn't actually see any of that because underneath the vine is covered in ryegrass and the general herbs that locally grow in our area. But it's a great photo to kind of show the soil type and our trellis of Shiraz. I think that's it. Yep. So how did I go for time? Pretty much bang on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. No, thank you, Peter. Yeah, there's a couple of questions I maybe have already received from one or two members that aren't here today. And one of them was for Sue Eames, who is obviously, I mean, I know you've talked very much about, why your wines are as they are, but she was just asking specifically sort of how you thought your wines of McLaren Vale, things separated McLaren Vale Shiraz from the other finer Shirazes in Australia.
Interesting. There's always, I see, I probably do the example of the other South Australian kind of Barossa. Barossa Shiraz has always an incredible viscosity to its Shiraz. It's probably the most full-bodied Shiraz generally that you'll see in Australia. It has even when it's picked not overly ripe, it has a fruit cake, Christmas cake type character to it. And probably a greater chocolatiness, and darker fruits and rounder tannins. Lots of them, but they're very round. McLaren Vale has generally much more bramble, blue fruited, being that close to the coast. It has a vibrancy about it. It generally doesn't have quite the intensity that Barossa has, I think, in a good way. But there are some producers that chase that. And I know, I know of growers that grow for Penfolds, specifically for their high-end programs where they hang it incredibly ripe, to bring that level of concentration that they are looking for some of those, for that blending. But they're also, even at those higher alcohols, there's a freshness that McLaren Vale brings that lifts the other areas. In its day, it was kind of said to be the middle palate of Australian Shiraz, because of that sweet fruit palate that it has. But as you go towards the hills, what's interesting, Blewett Springs especially is becoming renowned for these finer boned, more elegant red fruited Shirazes, that are kind of garnering, a real liking within the sommelier world, and which is very exciting because that's kind of smack bang where we are. And probably, I wouldn't say they're quite Northern Rhone-like, but there is as close to that as you will see in South Australia. You see a little bit of it in the Adelaide Hills as well, but sometimes in the Adelaide Hills it gets a bit cold and it can get a little lean and lacks a little bit of that lusciousness, and maybe even tannin ripeness that you still need with Shiraz. Yeah, so it's a fascinating time. We're definitely seeing this expression of interest and sales drive on Shiraz of more finesse, and that cooler part of McLaren Vale seems to be in a fabulous spot to deliver that.
Yeah, I was thinking it was more of the temperature. A lot of the temperature, as you say, the cooler wines. You have that give you that distinguish you. There's Wink has asked a question about Rhone and Southern French varieties, so I'll hand over to Wink now.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Peter. I saw on your map that you've got some very little quantities of Cru Noirs and Picpoul Noir and all the rest, and I just wondered sort of why you have them, how they're performing, and is it to do with insurance against climate change or just whatever you can tell us, please?
It's very much been I suppose a fascination around. One is an observation that Shiraz, for the most part, is a little bit on the decline in generally. I think it's still going to hold its own and obviously be around for the ages. And it is it's a relatively good heat and drought tolerant variety. It's also our story of Grenache and Shiraz from our vineyard. For us, we kind of see a inkling of climate to where we are to the Southern Rhone, and it was really very much a obvious kind of investigative kind of thing that we should be looking to be playing with some of these varieties. And when I'd seen some of these varieties, the spice and the fragrance and the complexity that some of these varieties bring, I think in small doses are very exciting. We make a blend, a red blend that is fascinating, that is really interesting and I put all those varieties together with Grenache. Grenache is the lead variety in that blend. I actually make the Shiraz for it as a rosé to blend with it, so that the Shiraz doesn't overpower all these other varieties, and it makes this beautiful, nearly Pinot Noir-like wine, and is what I would call our nearly warm climate Pinot style, if you like. It's probably not the best way to describe it, but trying to get across somewhat what I'm trying to do. And I think there's a great appetite for these lighter, medium-bodied wines. And as I said, Pinot Noir-like. You know, if I was a winemaker in the 60s or the 70s in McLaren Vale, I would have been calling it Burgundy. So, you know, that was what those kind of wines, that's what they were called. So yeah.
Thank you.
And on those varieties, Carignan's very exciting, although it's not a Southern Rhone. Well, it kind of is. It's not a Chardonnay variety, but it's showing great promise. The Counois is showing great promise too. Probably not necessarily standalone wines, but in blends, there's some excitement, I think.
Okay, thank you. Amanda's got a quick question.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I wondered if you could explain a bit further why you keep your Shiraz on the lees for 10 months, because my understanding that would create more reduction risks or problems. What is the kind of benefit that outweighs that?
Good reduction problem. So I think we talk about reduction probably in too broad a term, as in, so reduction during fermentation, i.e. yeast producing sulfide, versus sulfide that happens when the wine is kind of maturing in a reductive state. I suppose that difference between rotten egg gas and that lovely gunflinty character that you see in a great Chardonnay or Burgundy. And what I find is wines that are matured with that reduction from a maturation perspective is their longevity and their brightness and freshness is, I think, a greater result. But it's very important that the wine has had enough air during ferment and in clean enough, pristine condition when it does go to barrel and stays on lees. So it would be very unusual for us to have to rack a wine off lees in barrel. But if for whatever reason we hadn't got the ferment right and the time on skins right and the aeration right throughout that time, and we would take it off lees. But for the most part, that reductive state seems to nearly keep the wine in a more savoury state and slows down the tannin maturation so that the tannins, I suppose, are a little more crunchy and structured and tight and grainy. Every time you rack and return a wine from barrel, as they do in Bordeaux, because they're looking to soften and round those tannins. I'm nearly looking to keep the tannins a bit edgy and angular. So we're actually doing everything opposite but more to massage the wine to keep it in its slightly more reductive state without it being stinky.
Fascinating, cool. Is that just with the Shiraz, or do you do the same for all of your reds?
We do keep Grenache on lees as well. A lot of Pinot producers tend to do the same, more from an oxygen protection point of view. The other part is the lees bring a nice kind of textural mouthfeel as with that kind of contact on the lees, which I find adds a nice element that kind of ties in with the the slightly edgier, grainier tannins that I'm trying to showcase in our wines.
Awesome. Is there any risk associated with leaving it on the lees for that long?
Only bad reduction.
Okay.
So if you were not tasting it and you went into and the wine was a bit stinky, and then it became into that mercaptan irreversible sulfide situation, you'd be in a bit of trouble. The other part of doing that too is you also need to be very conscious of the temperature of your barrel store.
Mm-hmm.
If you are on lees, you've probably got a higher content of spoilage yeast in those yeast lees as well. So, if you are not topping your barrels regularly, you had a warm barrel store and you picked quite ripe and you had quite high pH, you would be quite at high risk of Brettanomyces spoilage yeast issues. So keeping those wine on yeast lees means you've got to be on your toes of having everything lined up, i.e. your barrel's top monthly and your barrel temperature, at probably very constant around that 14 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's quite cool.
Yeah. And generally, I actually just saw a lot of research out of a barrel supplier that works with a lot of Bordeaux and Burgundy producers, out of what they're also seeing, how important of oak characters showing in wines. If a barrel store gets too cold, it can actually suck a lot more air through the barrel because of the contraction of the barrel or the contraction of the wine in the barrel. And vice versa, if the wine's too hot, you get too much pressure within the barrel, and it's actually pushing wine deeper into the oak and getting more extraction. So for multiple reasons, those things actually are good to, holding that nice even temperature in your barrel store.
Interesting. Thank you. That's cool.
Thank you, Peter. So good stewardship.
Yeah, it's funny, that stewardship. I read a really great article a few years ago that was Andrew Jefford was interviewing Brian Crozer, and I wouldn't say Brian and I would necessarily see eye to eye on lots of things, but I couldn't agree with him more. They were talking about, I suppose, natural winemaking, which I'm somewhat of a proponent of some things. But the one thing that Brian spoke about was this constant observation and attention to detail, that you kind of, although you might not be doing huge amounts of interfering of, adjusting acid or huge extraction fermentations or using quite overt oaks or what have you, sometimes I can nearly catch myself as saying of minimal intervention, but we're actually having a lot of intervention through just attention to detail and watching and just refining all these lots of little 1%ers that I think bring a wine to the table that, because of all those things added up together, will showcase their place much better than another that either had less done to it or more done to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So reflected in the quality of the wine at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And you can talk about it all you want, but if you do it, hopefully it'll show out in the wine quality that you do.
Okay, and the one, I know you have touched on this, and is a question that's Chuck Byers in Ontario has asked about how climate change is affecting your estate in particular.
I think being more as nimble as we can in terms of picking. You're seeing probably narrower windows to pick optimum picking. We have a lot of bush vines. We have a lot of things in our vineyard that mean that we need to hand pick. So picking in narrow windows has its own challenges. It also puts a huge strain. You're trying to get every bit through, at the moment we're seeing our window is about 3 weeks. If climate change continues, and maybe it could be 2 weeks. So we've got to keep gearing up to be able to then swipe the whole vintage through the winery in 2 weeks, including the picking of it all.
That affects
that's
the
one of
picking
our
number
big
of
challenges.
pickers and everything, doesn't it, in the winery as well?
Oh, it does. It's a huge, and the amount of people that are in the staffed in the winery to be able to actually facilitate it, the amount of tanks, all sorts of. It's a really constant kind of something on top of my head. I think varieties. I think we're in good shape with that. I think we've kind of headed in the right directions. I think we'll also our ability in styles and is probably in good shape of picking earlier, because that enables us to be more resilient to it. Water security, we kind of don't have huge water security. We just probably have to deal with the lower crops in those years. And what we'll see is probably wine varieties like Mourvedre is probably the most heat tolerant of all the varieties we got. Years like that will do better. But what we've also seen with climate change is that we've probably had more cold vintages in the last 5 years than I've experienced, which is very odd as well. 2017, 2020, which we think of as being a very hot year. It was a very hot spring, but it was actually very cold. And 21 and 22 were both quite mild. It's been very odd. But I think what we are seeing in our region, I think every region gets different expressions of climate change. What we're seeing is we're getting greater swings. It could mean that we had this beautiful mild harvest this year. We could get the hottest on record next year. And then followed by that, we could have the wettest, coldest one. That seems to me is more the trend, is actually the unexpected.
You don't know what you're going to get.
Which makes it nearly doubly hard, because you kind of say, hey, well, it's getting hotter. We're just going to gear the vineyard up for being hotter. And then you get this big wet. It's like, well, I wasn't, and gearing up for each one of those is totally different. So you just kind of watch and be as careful as you can. Yeah.
There's just one quick question, because I know we are quickly running out of time. Is Amanda's again asked about if you could just talk through the rootstock choices?
Yeah. It's interesting. Of our recent plantings, so I would say probably 70% maybe of our vineyard is on own roots. So the earliest plantings on the estate are planted in 1946, which is the Grenache. There's nearly 17 hectares of old Grenache. And then we've got most of the Shiraz is planted in the mid and late 90s. So they're getting on a bit over 20 years old. They're all on own roots. And then all the newer plantings, some of those other Southern Rhone varieties are all on rootstock. We generally planted what we call medium vigor rootstocks that are obviously phylloxera tolerant, is the primary thing. We have to be a little bit careful. There are some great water tolerant rootstocks, but they come with that comes vigor. So if you get a wet spring, those water tolerant rootstocks will grow like triffids, and then also kind of because they grew so heavily in spring, they'll then have a higher demand on water. I see somebody, Amanda asked about Ramsey. Ramsey is that nasty variety. For our region, Ramsey will grow triffids in spring in our climate, and then fall over in the actual ripening period. They seem to work incredibly well in the Riverland. In warmer, hot, they kind of nearly need hotter climates than ours to perform. There was a bunch of Shiraz planted in Blewett Springs on Ramsey And these vines nearly touch each other between the rows. They grow so intensely. So it's finding, I think we've got a one that we really liked is Paulson. Like I said, a medium vigor, medium kind of thirst for water that seems to grow a nice balanced kind of vine. And there's definitely more work to go onto that. The other part that we're seeing is not really Shiraz related, but we're seeing, you know, Grenache, the scarcity of Grenache, and it's very limited plantings in McLaren Vale, although we're so well known for it. We want to plant more, but we're kind of waiting on more clonal diversity, which is actually only just coming. You know, we don't know a lot of the old vines grow great wine, but is it because they're just old vines, or is it because they're a good clone? We're seeing where we've replanted those, it's more so just probably because they're old vines. So we're actually kind of investigating a lot more diversity, which is starting to come through in the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.
No, I think
I hope that was just enough, or not too much, not too boring.
No, that was great. That was great. In fact, I want to thank you so much, Peter, for taking time with us this evening for you, of course. That was a fascinating journey of Shiraz and the history of Yangarra estate. Very interesting to hear about all the different soils, and of course your philosophy of winemaking, and thanks for sharing that with us. But it certainly seemed to trigger off a lot of questions and interest. And I'd also, of course, like to thank Millie Wiggin of Lux PR Agency for organizing that for us. And yeah, it was really great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.